Hey guys, tonight we descend into the rank, gritty, and gloriously awful world of medieval labor. A time when your job title said less about your career path and more about your risk of plague and burns. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Let's say you're born in medieval England and your career dreams are modest. You don't want to be a knight too stabby. You don't want to be a monk too quiet. So you take the path of least resistance. You become a gong farmer. Gong, in case you were wondering, is not a musical instrument here. It's medieval slang for human excrement. And a gong farmer was the lucky soul who got to remove it from latrines, cesspits, privies, wherever medieval people relieved themselves after a hearty meal of turnips and regret. You worked at night, not because the job was mysterious, but because it was so offensively pungent that townsfolk preferred not to be reminded of your existence during daylight. You arrived with a shovel, a bucket, and possibly some last shreds of dignity. You descended into the pit, some intimate ways deep, sometimes further, depending on how productive the town had been. The good news, gong farmers were actually paid well, sometimes more than carpenters or thatchers. The bad news, you earned every coin while marinating in centuries of communal shame. Now, health and safety weren't exactly priorities in the 1300s. Cesspits could collapse, methane could ignite. There are recorded cases of gong farmers passing out from fumes, slipping into thmuck, and dying in what can only be described as the worst obituary ever written. As for tools of the trade, a wooden bucket, a long-handled scoop, occasionally a donkey, not for companionship, just to haul the cart of waste out of town. The waste was then dumped in designated lay stalls, or usitas. Fertilizer, because nothing says organic farming like medieval bowl movements. Socially, gong farmers were avoided. You didn't exactly get invited to banquets, but some found camaraderie among fellow night soil collectors, probably while competing over who had the worst day. The smell? You didn't get used to it. You just stopped complaining. Eventually, it became part of your personality, so yes, the gong farmer may not have wielded a sword or worn a fancy hat, but they kept medieval cities from drowning in their own digestive legacy. They were the unsung heroes of sanitation, one bucket at a time. And if that sounds bad, don't worry, it gets worse. Let's say you're not cut out for urban cesspits. You want something more natural, outdoorsy, involving wildlife? Congratulations, you've just become a leech collector. The proud medieval professional who spent their days wading through bogs to harvest nature's little vampires. The job description was simple. Step into a pond, stand very still, and let leeches attach themselves to your bare legs. That's it. You are the bait. You outtrack them with your warm blood, your poor life choices, and your resigned expression. Once the slimy suckers latch and you yank them off and drop them into a jar, repeat until you feel faint from blood loss. Then head home for a nice nap and a probable infection. This wasn't just some fringe occupation either. Leeches were in high demand, thanks to medieval medicine's favorite treatment, letting people bleed. Got a headache? Leech it. Melancholy? Let's drain some joy out of you. Plague? Surely you just need slightly less blood. Barber surgeons loved leeches like modern influencers love ring lights. They were essential, and that meant someone had to collect thousands of them. Enter you, the walking pseudo-eerie board of the swamp. Protective clothing. Not really. Most collectors worked barefoot and bare-legged, often women or the very poor. The lucky ones wore a skirt, the unlucky ones wore welts. Oh. And if you were really unlucky, you'd come home with leeches still attached, growing plump and smug beneath your knees. And the hazards didn't stop at bloodsucking. These weren't sparkling, clean garden ponds. We're talking muddy, stagnant water filled with bacteria, frogs, and the occasional judgmental goose. You risked tetanus, trench foot, and trench shame. As for payment, a pittance. Be a few coins per dozen leeches, maybe food, but mostly you got the satisfaction of contributing to the fine art of bloodletting and the slow-motion downfall of patient. Health. On the bright side, you were unlikely to get mugged on the way home. No one wanted target that close. So you've tried human sewage and parasitic pond duty and you're thinking, what's next in this hool-crushing career ladder? Well, how about burying victims of the Black Death? That's right, you, dear viewer, are now a plague burier. Because in medieval times, death didn't wait for job interviews. This job came with 3 main requirements: shovel, a strong stomach, and a complete disregard for personal safety. Protective gear, please. At best, you might have a rag soaked in vinegar tied to your face. At worst, you had nothing but your own optimism, and some garlic Somione swore would repel evil vapors. When the plague hit in the mid-4th century, people dropped faster than common sense at a witch trial. Entire neighborhoods emptied overnight, corpses cesspoolled up in streets, homes, and churches. Someone had to move them. That's a mean. You mass graves or plague pits beckham your daily office, you'd spend hours digging trenches wide enough to toss an entire families. Sometimes they're wearing Tevin coffins, just bundles of limbs hastily wrapped in cloth, occasionally accompanied by a chicken for good luck. Or maybe it just wandered in, and don't expect gratitude. People avoided you like, well, the plague. If you showed up in the marketplace, everyone suddenly remembered they had somewhere else to be. You were considered bad luck, bad smell, and potentially contagious. A medieval triple threat. Now, the work was endless. No weekends, no holidays. The plague didn't take breaks, and neither did you. The worst part, Yak knew that every day on the job was a gamble. Many barriers became what they buried, especially after a sneeze or echo from the wrong direction. Compensation, in theory. The town council might toss-you a few coins or stale bread. In practice, you often got paid in continued existence. On the plus side, there was a sense of grim purpose. You kept cities from collapsing under the literal weight of death. But let's not romanticize it. You were basically playing Tetris with corpses while wondering if that weird itch on your arm was just fleas or fate. Welcome to the glamorous world of medieval textile production, where fashion met fermentation, and you, the humble fooler, made. Sure, nobody's wool tunic felt like a cactus, your job. Simple. Stomp on cloth soaked in human urine until it felt soft enough to pass for clothing and not medieval sandpaper. You see, raw wool is oily, stiff, and clings to everything like an unpaid intern. To turn it into wearable fabric, it needed to be fooled. A process involving soaking the cloth in a pungent cocktail of water, earth, and yes, urine. Why? Because stale human pee contains ammonia, which helped clean and soften the fibers. Why you had to stomp in it for hours, because machines hadn't been invented. Your feet were apparently God's gift to the medieval textile industry. Now, this wasn't a gentle toe dip situation. You were knee-deep in a vat of faded liquid, pounding fabric with your feet like a winemaker who took a very wrong turn in career planning. And you didn't just stomp once or twice. You did this for hours. Daily for years, you essentially lived in a foot bath of medieval woe and regret. The stench legend. So much so that fooling houses were built far away from towns, not for zoning regulations, but because no one could stand the smell of your profession existing within smelling distance. And let's talk health. Between trench foot, ammonia burns, and mystery rashes with names like God's curse, your body was constantly rebelling. Oh, and if your shoes got soaked too bad, they'd probably dissolve by the end of the week anyway. As for social standing, let's just say Fuller's didn't headline. Feasts. You were tolerated like rats in the pantry, or that one cousin who won't stop talking about herbal medicine. Still, there was some job security. People always needed clothes, and wool was king, so long as humanity sweated, itched, and wanted to look slightly less like wild goats. Your services were in demand. But at what cost? You wearing crafting couture? You were soaking your toes in other people's bodily fluids, hoping no one ever asked you what you did for a living over dinner. And yet somehow, things still managed to go downhill from here. Say you've had it with fluids, bodily or otherwise. And want a job that's dry? Technically, congratulations, you've just been promoted to treadwheel operator, the proud laborer inside a giant wooden hamster wheel. But instead of getting a treat at the end, you get chronic joint pain and a mild existential crisis. Y'all worked primarily in cathedral construction, lifting massive stones skyward with the power of your legs, and a complete disregard for spinal health. Picture a crane, but the motor is just you walking in circles like a confused pilgrim. Medieval. Engineers thought, what if we took a giant wheel, stuck a guy in it, and pretended physics wouldn't notice? Thet Red Mill Crane was born. The wheel was often suspended high above the ground, which means you weren't just walking in a wheel. You were walking in a wheel of death, 40 feet in the air. Lifting stones heavier than your entire extended family combined. Lose your footing? Gravity takes over? It's no longer a construction site. It's an impromptu funeral. It's the rhythm of your day. Walk, walk some more. Occasionally stop so someone can shove bread into her hand, then walk again. The wheel squeaks, the rope cacks, and your knees develop opinions. And God forbid your coworker in the second wheel gets ambitious and starts walking too fast. Suddenly, you're in a medieval spin class from hell. Safety standards non-existent. You were lucky if the axle didn't snap. Occasionally, someone forgot to properly secure the counterweight, and entire loads of stone went crashing down like the metaphor for your career. Was the pay good? Not particularly. You were paid in not being crushed today, which back then was a pretty decent benefits back. You might get some stew at the end of the shift if you still had enough energy to hold a spoon, the still you wear part, of something grand, a cathedral, a monument to faith, art, and architectural ambition. People would marvel at it for centuries, though probably never sparing a thought for this weedy human wheel hamster who hauled the stones into place, muttering about his aching ankles. But hey, at least you weren't stomping wool and pee anymore. Progress. So, you're tired of walking in circles and lifting rocks the size of marital regret? Maybe you want something with more movement, more drama, more risk of being bitten by something with fleas and bad intentions. Welcome to the glamorous life of a rat catcher. Yoon Sung, hero of urban hygiene, assuming you define hero as someone who runs a treatise with a stick and poor decision-making skills. Rats were everywhere in the medieval world. Grain stores, infested taverns, overrun castles, basically just upscale rat condos. And the solution to this plague of vermin wasn't poison traps or science. It was you, a person with a net, a dog, and a blank stare that says, I've seen things. Your average day involved crawling through dark, cramped spaces under buildings, chasing rats with nothing but your hands or a small club. Sometimes you used ferrets, sometimes terriers, sometimes pure desperation. All while trying not to get bitten, scratched, or sneezed on by the walking by hazards that scurred past your boots. And let's be clear, these weren't disnerets baking pies in someone's kitchen. These were disease-riddled, plague-carrying, rage-filled medieval rats. They lived off garbage, fought each other for bread crusts, and probably had better health insurance than you. The tools of the trade: a burlap sack, a torch, and possibly some boiled leather gloves that offered about as much protection as a soggy napkin. If you were lucky, you had a dog trained to snuff out nests. If you were unlucky, you had a torch and a lot of yelling. Pay? Let's just say nobody's getting rich chasing rats. You might get a few coins per tail? Yes, per tail. Which meant you had to bring proof of your rat conquest, like a grim medieval loyalty program. Occasionally, towns would hear at catchers during outbreaks, especially when people noticed an unusual number of corpses and fleas doing the cha. But once the panic died down, so did the budget and public respect, about the same as a puddle. No one wanted to sit near you, talk to you, or hear about your day. But deep down, everyone was relieved. You existed, Bez. Without you, the rats would inherit the earth, or at least the pantry. Let's say you want to work indoors. Maybe you like kids. Be a dream of courtly life, silk robes, and eating something that wasn't boiled in sadness. So you take a job in the palace, caring for a young noble. Sound scooshy, right? Wrong. You're the whipping boy, A living, breathing punishment troxy. In short, the prince misbehaves. You get whipped. Yes, that was an actual job. See, noble children, especially those of royal blood, were considered too important, too sacred, even to be physically punished. Can't bruise Staffordshire king just because he fed gunpowder to the cat. So instead, they appointed another child, often of lower status, to be his constant companion. And if the prince broke the rules, he took the lashes in front of him while you latched, hopefully with guilt, but usually with snacks. It was a strange form of moral outsourcing. You were supposed to be so emotionally close to the prince that he'd feel bad watching you get flogged. Cute theory, unless you were dealing with a budding tyrant who thought your screams sounded like music. Your day involved shadowing the royal child at lessons, meals, riding, swordplay. You were his confidant, his study partner, and on bad days, his scapegoat. If he sassed his tutor, you got the rod. Failed his Latin, hope you like bruises. Threw a tantrum, better start limping. There was no career path either. You didn't become senior whipping boy or deputy of the lash. You just aged out, assuming you survived without permanent spinal curvature. Surprisingly, some whipping boys did become lifelong friends with their royal tormentors. After all, nothing bonds to kids like a shared memory of one being beaten. For the other's misbehavior? Others, however, disappeared from their cords. Probably after walking off into the woods and deciding that friendship isn't supposed to hurt this much. Pay room, board, and maybe the occasional thank you note. No one built a statue to a whipping boy, but if you were lucky, you got to wear clean clothes and eat from the prince's table before bind thrashed for his food fight. So you've grown tired of rat bites and royal beatings. You long for solitude, fresh hair, and a job that doesn't involve actual children or rodents. Enter Thalim Burner, a man so committed to dust inhalation, he made chimney sweeps look like wellness. Influences your job. Burn limestone in a blazing hot kiln to produce quicklime. A vital ingredient in everything from mortar and plaster to grow culture. And fun twist corpses. That's right. Quicklime was occasionally used in burials to speed up decomposition. So your handiwork was everywhere, in walls, on fields, and quietly dissolving Uncle Jeffrey behind the church. The process involves stacking. Layers of limestone and fuel, wood peat, or if you were particularly eco-conscious, dried dung, into a massive oven called a lime kiln. Then you'd light it and bike out at hellfire temperatures for several days straight. And by you, I mean you stood next to it, shoveling materials and occasionally poking it with a long stick like some medieval pizza chef, if pizza exploded your lungs and caught your tunic on fire. Breathing near a lemnic was a bit like hugging a volcano while snorting chalk. The fumes were caustic, the dust was everywhere, and there was always the risk of spontaneous combustion. One gust of wind, and you were coughing up masonry flea while your eyebrows quietly disintegrated. Protective equipment, huh? You had a rag over your mouth if you were lucky, and a pair of wooden clogs if you were living large. Gloves, please. Oh. You had caustic enough to register as armor. Worse yet, quicklime reacts violently with water, so if it rained or you accidentally sweated too hard, the powder could hiss, bubble, and burn straight through your skin. Nothing like being slowly dissolved by your own profession. Social life minimal. Use mold like scorched earth, looked like. A haunted chimney, and your lungs made noises like a dying accordion. But on the bright side, people respected your work. You made the foundations of buildings, and occasionally helped create plague pits. That's practically a resume. Still, each shift brought you closer, Tobe, coming a lung-shaped pile of dust. Let's say you want a job with flexible hours, fresh air, and minimal supervision. You don't mind working nights, dislike authority, and aren't squeamish about corpses? Congratulations. You're a perfect material for a resurrectionist, otherwise known as a professional grave robber. But not just any grave robber. You're not stealing rings or gold teeth. No, you're after the whole body. Fortunes, of course. Totally academic. Please ignore the shovel and lack of soul. In the late medieval period, medical schools began demanding human cadavers for dissection. The problem? The church frowned on dissecting bodies and legal channels for obtaining corpseware tighter than a miser's coin purse. Enter you the resurrectionist, the entrepreneurial middleman between freshly buried and anatomy lecture. Your nights began. In the cemetery where you'd quietly dig up the newly interred undercover of darkness, ideally within 48 hours before things got too squishy. You worked fast, like a morbid speedrunner, often with a partner. One to dig, one to keep watch, and both to pretend you weren't about to yank a grandparent out of retirement. You didn't bother with coffins. Too heavy, too loud. It'd smash open the lid, pull out the body, and leave the valuables behind sometimes. It wasn't theft, you argued. It was science-adjacent recycling. Of course, not everyone appreciated your role in medical advancement. Families, for example, and the church, and the local cons, tabula, are airy. If caught, you could face a fine imprisonment. Or public shaming, though rarely execution, which seems ironic considering the amount of corpses you handled. Some towns began adding booby traps to graves. Iron cages, heavy, stones, even explosive devices. Yes, really. Nothing says rest in peace like a spring-loaded jaw trap guarding your fur. But the demand never stopped. Doctors needed cadavers and you were cheaper than a legal alternative. Sometimes you even had a standing order. One adult male, relatively intact, no visible plague. Payment, decent. Especially for something that required no training beyond to own a shovel and be dead inside. You earned more per body than most peasants saw in a month. Yes, the groom of the stool. The job thought proves no matter how glamorous court life may seem, someone still has to deal with the king's exit strategy. If you're wondering whether the title is metaphorical, it's not. Your full-time royal duty is to assist the monarch during his most private of private moments when he sits upon his portable, velvet-lined, gold-trimmed toilet box, the stool, and your job? Help him wipe. Let that sink in. This wasn't just some medieval prank gone too far. No, it was a respected position. In fact, the groom of the stool was often a nobleman, trusted implicitly by the king. Because when you've seen someone naked, sweating, and mid-grunt, you've achieved a level of intimacy few courtiers could rival. You didn't just wield cloth, you wielded influence. You controlled Hugo access to the king during his seated meetings. You managed his wardrobe, correspondence, and even advised on policy. It was a weird power dynamic. You were simultaneously the royal janitor and chief confidant. Thejib required discretion, loyalty, and a truly unshakable stomach. You might also be in charge of preparing the stool, ensuring the privy linens were fresh, and keeping the royal bottom powdered, perfumed, and presentable. Medieval kings didn't just rule, they pooped in style. Naturally, you were sworn to secrecy. Leaking royal bowel movements to the tavern crowd would be a career-ending move, and possibly a head-ending one. Still, court gossip being what it was, your knowledge of the king's diet and digestive habits made you a walking medical report, and a surprisingly popular one at that. As gross as it sounds, the position paid well. You lived in luxury, dined at the king's table, sometimes received landor titles, all for being literally indispensable. In the royal bathroom still, it's hard to brag at parties. Oh yes, I'm the reason the king doesn't chaff. Not quite as flashy as knight or chancellor, is it? So you fancy yourself a chef in the Middle Ages. That's adorable. Forget Michelin stars. You're aiming for a meal that doesn't actively harm anyone. As a medieval cook, your job was less about crafting exquisite cuisine and more about preventing gastrointestinal war crimes. You weren't working with the freshest ingredients. You were working with the least rotten ones, the stuff that smelled mostly fine and only twitched occasionally. Your tools included a giant cauldron, a wooden spoon the size of a battle axe, and a blazing fire that either burned your stew or your eyebrows, sometimes both. Recipes, please. A medieval recipe was usually something like, take meat, boil it, add a handful of herbs, pray.
Yes.
Quantities were vague, instructions were worse, and if someone complained, you just told them it was peasant. Style. Working in a noble household meant fancier expectations and fancier ways to hide spoilage. Spices like pepper, cinnamon, and cloves weren't for flavor. They were for masking the taste of doom. If the meat still moved, you just a dead more saffron. Problem solved. Poultry had feather sundial 5 minutes ago. Fish, hopefully not still blinking. Everything else went Tinto pottage. A one-pot mush of vegetables, barley, and meat scraps boiled until it surrendered. Where to the real her, however, was feast day. Hundreds of guests, dozens of dishes, all prepared in a dark, smoky kitchen where the ceiling dripped grease. The dogs licked the floor, and sometimes the food, and one scullery boy was always mysteriously missing. You were responsible for elaborate subtleties, sculptures made of sugar or meat, shaped like swans, dragons, or saints. That's right. You had to build a saint out officery and still find time to boil 50 cabbages. If it collapsed, guess who got blamed? Not St. John the Melty, that's fur. Sure. Burns, cuts, infections, and food poisoning were all part of the job. There was no refrigeration, no health inspector, and no sympathy when the Lord's pigeon pie exploded. Still, if you managed to not poison anyone too important, you might just keep your job for now. Born appetite, so you're not afraid of a little hard work. Maybe you enjoy the outdoors. Maybe you think lifting heavy things will give you biceps worthy of a church fresco. Welcome to the life of a quarryman, where your job is to fight rocks, literally, and the rocks usually win. As a quarryman in medieval times, your day began before sunrise and ended when your arm stopped responding to commands. Your task? Cut, smash, and haul gigantic chunks of stone out of the earth with nothing but rudimentary tools and the sheer force of poor life choices. No fancy drills, no hydraulics, just hammers, chisels, wedges, and a deep personal vendetta against granite. You'd start by hammering iron spikes into natural fissures to split the rock, which worked eventually if you hit the sum spot hard enough. Often enough, while your hearing slowly retired from existence. For extra fun, you could pour cold water into hot cracks to try and shock the stone apart. Because when your job involves thermoticums, it's a good sign something has gone terribly wrong. Dust everywhere in your lungs, your teeth, your bread. Safety goggles hadn't been invented, so you squinted and hoped today wasn't Thede. A rogue flake of limestone introduced itself to your cornea. Let's not forget the real thrill. Cave-ins and falling slabs. One wrong tap and you could trigger a domino effect of screaming, scrambling, and a very awkward workers' compensation hearing, which back then was just a priest saying, well, he died. Doing what hated? Your reward? A few coins? A sore back? And the knowledge that your stones might one day become a cathedral, or a dungeon, or a privy wall legacy? If you were lucky, you'd be assigned to quarries near limestone or sandstone, the soft rocks. If not, you might find yourself fipping away at granite, which is about as forgiving as a tax collector with a hangover. Social status somewhere between background character and local ghost story. Romance prospects only if Somione was into perpetual grime and conversational wheezing. But hey, at least you didn't work indoors. So, you'll think you've got a good cardio routine? Try being a wartime messenger in the Middle Ages, a job that combines marathon running, high-stakes diplomacy, and the constant risk of being mistaken for an enemy spy with really bad luck. Your job description was simple. Carry vital military information across miles of enemy-infested terrain without getting shot, stabbed, trampled, eaten, or arrested. Think of yourself as a medieval USB stick, but with worse encryption and a much higher mortality rate. Essential. You had Tomov fast enough to outrun horses, outwit bandits, and occasionally shout the phrase, "Don't kill me, I work here," in multiple languages. If you couldn't run, you rode. But horses Medeo more visible, and visibility in a war zone was not what you wanted unless you were a flag. Your deliveries, battle orders, secret troop movements, surrender demands, or awkward letters explaining why the king's reinforcement are 3 weeks late and very drunk. If intercepted, you might be tortured for information, caught by your own side during a uniform change. You might be mistaken for a spy and hanged before you could even say, "Wrong camp. Sorry." Weather didn't care. You were expected to gallop through storms, mud, snow, or scorching sun, all while keeping Ascroll dry and legible, because nothing says logistical failure like ink soup, sometimes. You delivered messages during the battle itself, weaving between clashing lines to inform one commander thought. The left flank had either collapsed or wandered off in search of lunch. Archers didn't care. Cavalry couldn't see you. Everyone else too busy stabbing each other to hear, "Please don't skewer the guy with the parchment. And if you survive the delivery, guess what? You gotta go back. Pay not bad, if you wear fast." Discreet and had a sixth sense for danger. Survival odds slightly higher than being a catapult projectile, but only slightly. Still, for all its risks, the role had a strange nobilitito. You were the fragile thread holding armies together. The voice between kings, the guy who sprinted while everyone else ducked, because nothing says hero quite like carrying bad news. At full speed, the blacksmith. The medieval town's human furnace, part craftsman, part magician, and full-time sweat fountain. If it involved heating metal until it glowed like the sun, and then hitting it with a hammer until it begged for mercy, you were the person for the job. Your workspace, a forge hotter than a knight's armpit in July, filled with soot, sparks, and enough noise to scare off any notion of peace. You didn't need a rooster to wake the village. Just the rhythmic skull-rattling clang, clang, clang of your daily metal opera. Blacksmiths made everything. Horseshoes, plowshares, swords, nails, armor, hinges, and about 600 other objects that people broke weekly, and they all wanted them yesterday. Romantic prospects weren't bad. My ox had muscles and permanent coala hammer holder. My gate small talk was tough. I need a new sword. When every sentence was followed by a coughing fit and a mysterious burst off flames from behind you. Them. Let's talk danger. Then suddenly, red hot metal, brother Thomas exploding nails sparks on the side, iron that cracks instead of bends, burned, anvils that don't care about your toes, bellows that occasionally catch fire because why not? It's one distracted moment and your beard becomes a candle. And if you worked for a castle or army, congratulations. You're mass-producing weapons for impatient men. Woe. Solve disagreements with axes. Hope you like deadlines enforced by sword. But despite it all, the blacksmith was essential. You were the backbone of technology, the town's answer to. Can you fix it? Long before engineers, you were designing tools. Long before influencers, you were shaping trends. You made the stuff people needed to survive and occasionally look impressive. While doing it, still, you never got statues. It's just more broken metal and a customer asking if it'll be cheaper without the decorative curls. Ah, yes. The bard, the wandering performer, the poet with the lute, the medieval equivalent of a podcast no one asked for but couldn't turn off because they were staying in your lord's hall. Being a bard sounds romantic until you realize your job is part musician, part gossip, part court jester, and full-time cold and hungry. You wandered from town to town with nothing but your instrument, your verses, and a suspicious cough. You sang of kings, of battles, of doomed lovers, of dragons that were probably just overgrown lizards. Anything to earn a coin, a meal, or at the very least not get pelted with turnips. Every gig was different. One night, you'd be serenading nobles in a candle-lit hall. The next, you'd be dodging drunk peasants in a smoky tavern as someone shouted, "Play the one where the knight gets eaten." And you had to because that song paid in bread. Your biggest challenge wasn't remembering the lyrics. It was surviving. Politics. One wrong word about the Lord's haircut and suddenly you're the subject of the next execution ballad. The line between clever satire and treasonous insult was razor-thin and heavily patrolled. You were also expected to memorize hysteria, which in medieval terms meant whatever the person paying you wanted to be true. Did Sir Godfrey win the battle? Doesn't matter. If he's buying your dinner, Sir Godfrey absolutely crushed it. And hygiene. Let's just say bars were known more for mood than scent. Lice, fleas, and boots with holes were standard. Your clothes smelled like firewood and failure, but you made up for it with charm, wit, and an unnatural ability to rhyme sword with bard. Still, you held power. You shaped public memory. You spread news faster than a town crier with a megaphone. You were medieval PR, but with more stringed monstrance and less shame. Occasionally you'd strike gold and become a court bard, living in a noble shows, writing songs for weddings and war campaigns. Until you rhymed honor with goner and found yourself back on the road. So yes, the bard's life was romantic in theory. In practice, it was freezing, itchy, and entirely dependent on your ability to make rhyming couplets under pressure. It began with whispers. Whispers of sails shaped like dragon wings, of warriors. With iron beards and eyes like frozen seas, the Seine had always been a lifeline for Paris. Wide, proud, serene. But in the spring of 845, the river became a warning. The Frankish towns along the coast fell silent one by one. No bells, no smoke from hearths, just drifting wreckage and blood on the tide. When the news reached Paris, it wasn't a question of if the Norsemen would come. It was when and how bad it would be. This time. But this wasn't just any raid. This wasn't a loose band of sea looking for gold and sheep. This was Ragnar Lodbrok. To the Franks, his name sounded like thunder cracking through a church roof. Ragnar, the man who had once claimed descent from Odin himself. Ragnar, whose sons would go on to terrorize Europe, but who at this moment was very much alive, charismatic, and foaming at the mouth for plunder. With 120 longships and more than 5,000 warriors at his back, he didn't sneak toward Paris. He announced himself. His sails cast shadows on the riverbanks. The rhythm of oars churned the sand like a march of fate. Every monastery and village along the river was looted, burned, or enslaved. The Franks prayed. Their king, Charles the Bald, scrambled to assemble defenses. But his realm was already stretched thin by civil war and infighting. The church screamed for divine intervention. The nobles argued over which bridge to defend. Meanwhile, Ragnar kept rowing. He didn't need siege engines or complex strategies. He had fire, he had fear, and he had time. Parisians stood atop their half-finished walls and watched as the river darkened with approaching death. Mothers hid their children in wine cellars. Priests tightened their grip on relics. And the king's messengers, sweaty, terrified, barely literate, begged neighboring cities for reinforcements that would never arrive in time. The Norse were no longer myths whispered in the tavern. They were real, and they were here. And at their helm stood Ragnar, laughing, wild and ready to make history. There was no mistaking them. Long, narrow hulls skimming through like serpents, their prows carved into snarling beasts, eyes painted to ward off evil, except this time, the evil was already on board. Ragnar's fleet wasn't a ragtag group of fishermen turned raiders. These were professionals shirred by years of conquest in England, Ireland, and the North Sea. Each long ship was a floating war machine rowed by men who measured time by battles and blood. Their shields hung in neat rows along the sides, forming a wall of painted death. Behind them, stud warriors with braided hair and tattooed arms, some clad in chainmail stolen from Frankish corpses, others be-chested and smeared with Marden ash for intimidation. And it worked. As Ragnar's ships moved up the Seine, every village and abbey along the way became a rehearsal for the main act. Parish churches were torched. Clergymen were slaughtered or dragged off in chains. Frankish soldiers who dared resist were skewed and tossed into the river. And if the villagers were lucky, they were merely robbed. If not, they were put to the torch with everything they owned. Rod made sure to leave survivors, not out of mercy, but as a tactic. He wanted word of his wrath to reach Paris before he wanted the city to stew in its own dread, and it worked. What made his fleet so terrifying wasn't just the numbers, it was the coordination. These weren't frenzied berserkers attacking blindly. Ragnar divided his forces like a chess master. Some raided inland, looting monasteries like Sandon. Others guarded the ships. And always, the river was their highway and lifeline. And then, like some cruel theatrical crescendo, they reached the gates of Paris, the Frankish capital, still reeling from civil wars, famine, and plague, now had to face an army that didn't negotiate, only pillaged. At the city walls, Ragnar ordered the burning of captured Frankish villages within sight of the gates. Smoke rose like a dark prophecy. He wasn't just threatening the city, he was daring them to stop him, as the flames reflected off the Seine. And onto his painted sails, Ragnar looked at the stone walls of Paris, not with fear or reverence, but with hunger. Because for Ragnar, Paris wasn't a challenge, it was a prize. Paris in 845 was not yet the towering fortress of later centuries. It was a city huddled on an island, the Ile de Cite, flanked by 2 wooden bridge sand, protected by makeshift walls. Its defenders were few, mostly local militia, monks with swords, and nobles more interested in their titles than warfare. In short, it was dinner for Ragnar. The Viking chieftain wasted no time. Upon arrival, he launched a probing attack on the outskirts, testing the resolve of the defenders. What he found was laughable. The Frankish response was disorganized, slow, terrified. So Ragnar pushed forward, laying siege to the heart of Paris. He divided his forces, surrounding the island from both riverbanks. The Seine belonged to him now. No boats in, no boats out. Trade stopped. Food trickled in. Panic trickled out. Ragnar's men set up campfires on every side, playing dice, drinking me, and sharpening blades just within earshot of the city walls. They knew the waiting game well. The longer siege, the weaker the prey. Paris tried to resist. Archers were placed along the bridges. Bells rang constantly. Priests held mass 3 times a day, begging divine intervention, while ignoring the stench of fear in the air. The Franks attempted a counterattack, a sortie from one of the bridges, but it ended in disaster. Ragnar's men feigned retreat, lured the Franks into open terrain, and ambushed them. Bodies floated back to the city, bloated and broken. Ragnar, ever the showman, escalated things. He captured dozens of Frankish soldiers during a skirmish. Instead of holding them for ransom, he crucified them right there on the riverbanks. Helofed their bodies for all Paris to see, as if to say, "Your prayers mean nothing to me." Inside the walls, famine began its slow creep. With every passing day, food stocks dwindled, morale cracked, and disease spread. The people looked to their king, Charles the Bald, but he was nowhere to be seen. He had fled to safety. Panicked. This wasn't supposed to happen. Not on his watch. He was a Carolingian king, a descendant of Charlemagne, the hammer of pagans. Yet here he was, being outmaneuvered by a pagan pirate with excellent cheekbones and a penchant for setting things on fire. Charles had problems. The first was his fractured kingdom. The Frankish Empire had splintered into rival factions, and Charles's own nobles had the loyalty of wet bread. Every call for reinforcements was met with excuses. "We're guarding our own lands," or "Good luck, Your Majesty." No one wanted to throw their troops into Ragnar's meat grinder. The second problem was money, or the lack of it. The treasury was thin, drained by years of internal conflict and religious spending sprees. But worse than that was the humiliation. Paying off Vikings was a stain on royal honor. Still, Charles was running out of options, and honor wouldn't keep his throne warm if Ragnar decided to sack the capital. So he tried bargaining. Messengers were dispatched with frantic offers. Gold, supplies, even titles if the Vikings would just leave. But Ragnar didn't flinch. He didn't want empty promises. He wanted Paris, and he was willing to wait until the people inside started eating each other. Then came the desperate gamble. Charles assembled a last-minute army. Nothing grand, just a patchwork. Force of half-trained peasants, local counts, and anyone willing to trade their lives for a handful of silver. Their mission? Break siege and rescue the city. It went exactly as you'd expect. Ragnar caught wind of the first boot hit the riverbank. His men ambushed the relief force near the outskirts. What followed was a slaughter. Charles's reinforcements were butchered, routed, or captured. Those captured were executed with Ragnar's social flair. Some hanged from trees, others used for target practice. Back in his court, Charles received the news like a punch to the liver. It failed. His army had failed. Paris was out of time. So, swallowing his pride like bitter ale, Charles reached for the last card in his deck, Thebreb. Because when swords fail, gold speaks. In the end, it wasn't faith, fire, or Frankish steel that saved Paris. It was silver. Lots and lots of silver. Charles the Bald, out of armies and excuses, did what every ruler dreads. Heck at a deal. It wasn't brave. It wasn't glorious. It was survival. And it came with a humiliating price tag. That's over 2.5 tons of treasure. Enough to bankrupt a region and enough to make. Ragnar's beard twitched with amusement, but Charles wasn't negotiating from strength. He was negotiating from his knees. His envoys approached Ragnar's camp with trembling hands and bulging coin sacks. No fanfare, no threats, just a desperate plea. Take the silver. Leave the city, and maybe, just maybe, leave us some dignity. Ragnar, being a professional, didn't gloat, at least not immediately. He listened, squinted thoughtfully, and probably pretended to consider rejecting the offer for dramatic effect. But of course, he took it. He hadn't dragged 5,000 warriors, cross half of Franchurgis to play demolition derby with some underwhelming walls. He came for treasure, and the Frankish king had just opened the vault. The handover wasn't ceremonial, it was transactional. Chest after chest of silver was carted down to the Viking ships. The Franks looked on in silence. The Vikings looked on. With glee, some danced, others drank. Few openly debated whether they should take Eth money and sack the city anyway. But Ragnar, ever the tactician, chose a reputation over greed. By accepting the ransom and sparing Paris, he sent a louder message than any torch or axe could. I can break you, but I don't have to. Just pay me. It was economic warfare, nor sedition. The Franks were stunned. Their king had just paid a fortune to a pagan warlord and let him sail away untouched. The clergy choked on their incense. The nobles seethed behind closed doors. But citizens, they were just relieved to be alive. The siege lifted, the bridgeware cleared, the fires died out. And Ragnar. He loaded the silver, raised his sails, and began the journey home. Victorious, untouched. Paid like a king bee, a man who actually was one. And behind him, Paris stood smoldering not in ruins, but in shame. With silver clinking in his hull and smoke curling in the distance, Ragnar turned his long ships back down the Seine. Not as a raider fleeing, but as a conqueror departing on his own terms. His warriors sang, their voices echoing off the riverbanks like the final laugh of a villain who got away with everything. Ragnar hadn't just won a battle, he'd won a myth. As the fleet drifted downstream, they passed the Samarin villages scorched, abbeys, and looted monasteries they had ravaged on the way up. Nothing stood in their path. The Franks wouldn't dare, not after what had happened in Paris. Not after seeing their king reduced to a checkbook. Some legends say Ragnar had his ship so weighed down with silver that he had to jettison some of it into the river to stay afloat. Others claim he paraded the crucified Frankish prisoners as a parting gift. Whatever the truth, one thing is certain. Left Frontieriker, more infamous and completely unscathed. There were no real attempts to stop him. Charles the Bold, licking his wounds, had no appetite for another humiliation. And even if he did, he no longer had the resources or the trust of his people to do anything about it. He'd paid off the wolf and now had to live with the scent of blood on his doorstep. For Ragnar, the journey home was more than a retreat. It was a victory parade. His reputation exploded across Europe. To the Norse, he was a legend, Madaflesh, proof that the gods favored the bold. To the Franks, he was a knight Mareth couldn't wake from. To other Viking leaders, he was now the gold standard for raiding. Burn, terrorize, and Thengit paid to leave. The psychological wound left behind was deeper than any blade. After all, Ragnar hadn't breached Paris with ladders or siege engines. He broke it with fear, fire, and audacity. And that may have been the most terrifying part. He could have taken the city, but he didn't need to, as the dragon-headed ships disappeared. Over the horizon, one fact remained crystal clear. Ragnar Lodbrok had just robbed one of the most powerful kings in Kristiansund and sailed away without a scratch. The age of the Viking was no longer coming. It had arrived. When the dragon ships vanished and Thurver went quiet, Paris didn't celebrate. It exhaled slowly, shakily, like a city waking from a nightmare. The siege was over, but the trauma had just begun. The city wryer of smoke and sweat and unwashed fear. Its bridges were scorched, its churches desecrated, its streets littered with the bones of failed resistance. And while the walls still technically stood, the idea of safety had been reduced to ash. People crept out from cellars and crypts with hollow eyes, as if expecting the Norsetto come back and finish the job. The first thing to return wasn't hope, it was blame. Fingers pointed in every direction. The clergy blamed the king for his cowardice. The nobles blamed each other for not sending aid. That people blamed both, hovering above it all, was the bitter truth. Charles the Bald had paid off the enemy and left his capital city to rot. There was no spinning it as a tactical retreat or clever diplomacy. Everyone knew what it was, a payout, born of panic. The church tried to paint the survival of Paris as a divine miracle, test of faith, or a sign of future redemption. But the people knew better. It wasn't angels who had spared them, it was silver. To make matters worse, Theransem had gutted the royal treasury. Inflation rose, taxes soared, monasteries wept over their stolen relics. The countryside, already weary from years of civil war and famine, buckled further, and with each passing day, the legend of Ragnar Lodbrok grew taller, while the authority of the Carolingian throne grew smaller. Militarily, the implications were even more damning. Ragnar had exposed the soft underbelly. Of Frankish defenses hadn't need catapults or battering rams. He just needed a river and a cause. Their Norse leaders took note. If Paris could be shaken so easily, what else was ripe for the taking? And perhaps most anting of all was the feeling that this wasn't the end. It was the beginning. A prelude. A warning. Paris had survived. Yes, but it had also been humiliated, scarred, and forced to buy its own life. That kind of wound doesn't fade quickly. And in the smoky, silent sea followed. One question lingered over every broken gate and prayer-stained floor. What happens when the next Ragnar arrives? The raid on Paris in 845 didn't end when Ragnar sailed home. In truth, it began something far more enduring, a legacy of terror, strategy, and cultural domination that echoed through Europe for generations. Monasteries buried their holy relics hearing what Ragnar had accomplished, not out of piety, but out of fear. The Frankish response, fortify and pray. Through the north, but it wasn't enough. And with it came a revelation. In time, the Viking raids you didn't have to die gloriously in battle first to make your mark. Camps, then fortresses, then towns. By the end of the 9th century, Norsemen had carved out more permanent footholds in France, including the area that would become Normandy. Soon raiders from literally the land of the north, Norway and Sweden. It all traced back to Ragnar's siege of Paris, and Ragnar, they weren't just reckless marauders. Beyond the battlefield, they were businessmen with axes. Sagas were told. Viking raids say he later attacked Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, was thrown into a pit of snakes, and laughed as he died. Each summer brought new fleets. Others claim he lived Althus days in comfort, watching his sons tear Europe apart. In his name, whatever the truth, the Viking image of Ragnar, the cunning, brutal, unshakable world, was now immortal. He was no longer just a man. He was a model for how a single leader could exploit a fractured kingdom, crack its pride, and sail away a legend. The siege of Paris was not just a Viking success, it was a template for Viking domination. Paris survived, but it would never be the same. The memory of Ragnar's siege carved itself into the stone of the city, into the nightmares of its clergy, and into the policy of every king who followed Charles the Bald. It wasn't just a story. It was a warning, Aramindur. that even the mightiest city could be brought to its knees by a man in a long ship with nothing but fire, grit, and a greedy grin. The Frankish response in the decades that followed was nothing short of paranoid. Paris began to fortify, not just with thicker walls and sturdier bridges, but with policy. River traffic was monitored. Watchtowers rose like angry sentinels along the Seine, and the monarchy, bruised and humiliated, slowly clawed its way back to respectability by reforming the military and centralizing power. Eventually, these painful lessons laid the groundwork for what would become the Capian dynasty, the future of France. But trauma lingered. To the average Parisian, the name Ragnar wasn't legendary. It was personal. Parents used it to frighten children into obedience. Do your chores or the Northmen will come. Merchants and monks alike remembered the screams in the streets, the black smoke, and the silence that followed. And even as the years passed, whenever a foreign sail appeared on the horizon, old men muttered, "They've come again." Yet the legacy wasn't all fear. Siege catalyzed a strange cultural exchange, albeit one soaked in blood. Viking mercenaries would one day serve Frankish kings. Norse settlers in Normandy would become Christian lords. The enemy at the gates would become deck knights in the court. It was ironic, almost poetic, that the very culture thought once looted Paris would later defend it. Still deep in the DNA of Thessaly, something had changed. Ragnar's siege had shattered the illusion of invincibility. Paris was not untouchable. It had been bought, broken, and spared, and the city never forgot a bitter lesson. Every archbishop who blessed a sword, every tax collector who weighed a coin, every soldier who manned a wall, each was acting in the long shadow of 845. Because when one man armed with only Aeron, fire and nerve can make an empire tremble and a king pay up. The world notices and the world forever after changed. In the Middle Ages, the road to salvation didn't start in a church pew. It started with blisters. To be a good Christian wasn't just about going to Mass or confessing your sins. Sometimes it meant putting one foot in front off the other and walking for hundreds of miles to visit a holy site. These journeys were called pilgrimages, and they were both deeply spiritual and absurdly physical. Picture a barefoot farmer trudging through rain, snow, and occasionally codong, all to stand in front of a saint's knucklebone in a gilded box. The motivation? Eternal salvation, or at the very least, divine brownie points. The church promoted pilgrimages as a way to earn indulgences. Committed adultery, go to Santiago Leto. A priest, try Canterbury. Murdered someone, well, maybe start walking to Jerusalem and don't stop. But it wasn't always about guilt. Pilgrimage could be an act of gratitude, a request for healing, or just an excuse to leave your village without being labeled a heretic. For women, it was one of the few ways to travel with some social acceptance. For knights, it was a detour from stabbing. People to prove how holy they were. For many, it was just the only vacation they were ever going to get. The call to pilgrimage came in many forms. A dream, a sermon, or the sharp nudge of a local priest saying, "Yaukno. God might forgive you if you walk 800 miles with a sore back and no shoes." It wasn't uncommon for families to send a representative pilgrim. It's kind of like spiritual outsourcing. One person walking could supposedly earn blessings for the whole clan. Lucky them. Once committed, pilgrims receive a blessing and don the telltale signs. A staff, a satchel, and a distinctive badge often shaped like a scallop shell or a cross. These symbols marked them as holy wanderers, not vagrants, which was an important distinction when sleeping in barns and begging for food. But make no mistake, a pilgrimage wasn't a stroll in the countryside. It was a journey laced with exhaustion, uncertainty, and a faint hope that at the end of the road something divine would be waiting. That is, if the road didn't kill you first. Before the first step on the dusty road, the medieval pilgrim faced a dilemma. What to bring when you're about to walk 1,000 miles on foot with no Amazon delivery, no waterproof boots, and definitely no snack bars? The answer? As little as humanly possible, but still too much. Pilgrims packed their lives into azazel, the size of a modern handbag. Weight was the enemy. Every extra tunic meant 1 more ounce to carry across mountains, swamps, and bandit-ridden woods. And so they brought the barest of essentials. Spare linen shift if you were lucky. Bit of dried food, a flask or water skin, and maybe, just maybe, a small religious token to remind you that your suffering was entirely on purpose. Then came the staff. This wasn't a hiking accessory. It was a multifunctional miracle stick. You used it to walk, to defend yourself against wild dogs or wild people, to test the depth of mud pits, and sometimes to prod sneering fellow pilgrims in church. Your hat had to be wide-brimmed for Sunand rain, and preferably pilgrim chic. Bonus points if it had a scallop shell into it, the universal badge of pilgrimage to Santiago de Compostela. That shell could grant you access to monasteries, soup kitchens, and free hay in barns. Think of it as your medieval passport, except it didn't expire. Everyone knew you were probably broke. Footwear was another misery entirely. Most pilgrims wore sandals or low leather shoes, barely better than going barefoot. Blisters weren't a possibility. They were a guarantee. Many wrapped their feet in linen and prayed they wouldn't rot before reaching the next shrine. For food, you didn't pack muck. Instead, you relied on the kindness of strangers, monasteries, or fellow pilgrims. And kindness might mean a bowl of onion soup with a side of dry bread. If you were too proud to beg, congratulations, you were also too proud to eat. Perhaps the most essential item wasn't even physical, a letter of pilgrimage. This document issued by the church proved you weren't just a wandering bum. It was sore holy permission slip, and without it, you might end up in jail instead of heaven. So with aching feet, an overloaded sack, and a silent prayer, the pilgrims set out. Because when packing for the afterlife, there's no such thing as traveling light. Once you left the comfort of your village or whatever passed for comfort in medieval Europe, you entered the vast, unpredictable theater of the road. Anthy Road didn't care about your prayers. Let's start with the terrain. Medieval roads were not roads in the modern sense. They were glorified footpaths or muddy death traps depending on the weather. Rain turned everything into soup. Snow hid wolves, summer cooked your flesh, and attracted every biting insect between. Normandy and Jerusalem. Bandits were a constant threat. Pilgrims were easy prey. Unarmed, poorly fed, and often carrying small amounts of coin or religious trinkets worth selling. A pilgrim walking alone was basically a Mabel donation box with legs. Even traveling in groups wasn't always safe. Some thieves dressed as fellow pilgrims to blend in. Nothing says betrayal like getting robbed by a guy wearing the same scallop shell as you. Then there were the animals. Wolves, bears, wild boars, all ready to remind you that being eaten alive could also be considered penance. Dogs roamed freely and were less man's best friend, and more territorial monsters with mange. One wrong turn through the woods and you weren't just off course, you were on the menu. Even more treacherous than bandits or beasts was temptation. Pilgrimage routes were lined with taverns, brothel, and gambling pits, especially near large towns. Some pilgrims never made it past the first city before their vow of piety turned into a haze of wine, dice, and regret. The church disapproved, of course, but the tavern owners, they welcomed your soul's downfall with open arms and cheap ale. Even your fellow pilgrims could be a problem. There were scammers, freeloaders, and self-proclaimed prophets preaching strange visions in exchange for food. Arguments erupted over sleeping space, directions, and who smelled worse. You could be halfway to Rome and suddenly find yourself in a heated debate about the Virgin Mary with a barefoot fisherman from Flanders. And yet somehow most kept walking. The journey was part endurance test, part spiritual obstacle course. Every mud-wrenched mile, every wolf howling in this distance, every temptation resisted or shamefully indulged. It all became part of the story, part of the sacrifice. Because holiness wasn't earned inside a cathedral. It was earned with every blistered step in the mud. After weeks or months of hobbling through filth, hunger, and sin, the pilgrim finally saw it. Rising above the hills, a spire, a dome, or a shimmering shrine, the holy site, the place where miracles supposedly happened. And it was usually similar than expected, whether it was the shrine of St. Thomas Becket in Canterbury, the bones of St. James in Santiago de Compostela, or a suspiciously well-preserved toe of St. Margaret somewhere in France. The destination varied, but the vibe remained sacred hype. These sites were a medieval version of Disneyland, but instead of roller coasters, you got sacred relics, candlelight processions, and the occasional exorcism. The relics themselves were the main attraction. But let's be honest, medieval Europe had a bit of a relic inflation problem. There were enough splinters of the true cross to build a forest. Everyone claimed to have the skull of John the Baptist, sometimes 3 in the same city. Authenticity wasn't really the point. Belief was. Pilgrims would crawl on their knees to reach the relic. Some wept, others fainted. Many simply touched the shrine and whispered a desperate prayer. Heal my blindness, forgive my adultery. Fix my aching back. The belief was that saints had posthumous superpowers and their bones could still grant miracles like medieval vending machines. And where there were miracles, there was money.
Ounce!
Towns built around these shrines profited enormously. Inns, taverns, trinket sellers, and monks with suspiciously high prices for special blessings thrived. You could buy candles, holy water, amulets, and even tiny flasks allegedly filled with saintly sweat. An express lane to forgiveness. The church encouraged it. Pilgrimage sites brought prestige, donations, and a steady stream of religious tourism. Entire cathedrals were built just to house a single toe or dried-up tunic. And the more dramatic the legend behind the relic, the bigger the crowds. Bleeding statues, check. Incorruptibilities. Absolutely. Talking skulls. You bet, someone claimed. But even amid spectacle, many pilgrims found genuine awe. Standing in candlelit silence before a golden relic, after surviving the brutal road, felt like arriving at the edge of heaven. It may not have looked like much, but to a weary soul, that shrine was everything. Pilgrimage wasn't just a spiritual journey, it was big business. Every step a pilgrim took meant coins changing hands. Inns, taverns, blacksmiths, relic vendors, and even beggars depended on the flow of the faithful. And when hundreds or even thousands of pilgrims funneled through a town each year, the local economy didn't just survive, it thrived. Enter the pilgrim trap. A village with a mediocre shrine would suddenly experience a vision, a miracle, or a goat giving birth with a crucifixed mark on its side. The next thing you knew, a chapel popped up, candles were lit, and someone was charging 3 denarii for a look at a finger bone allegedly belonging to Saint someone or other. Tourists came, merchants followed, and the church gave its blessing after. Collecting a tidy cut of the offerings, of course the most profitable sites like Santiago de Compostela became pilgrimage megahubs. Entire industries sprang up. Cloak weavers for the dusty traveler, cobblers to patch torn shoes, and bakers who made dry, durable bread that could last through weeks of misery. You could even find medieval pilgrim guides, men who promised protection, and directions for a price. Sometimes they were legitimate. Sometimes they were just well-dressed robbers with a contract. Merchants sold souvenirs by the wagon load. Little tin badges shaped like the shrine's relic were worn proudly by pilgrims, signaling where it had been like medieval travel stickers. You could even buy fake ones if you were too lazy or too smart to tote the whole route. Monasteries played a major role too. Far from being spiritual retreats, many operated like well-oiled hospitality machines. Monks would welcome pilgrims with beds and bowls of soup, but not without a suggested donation. Some were genuine likened. Others had a knack for holy pricing. And then there were the scammers, Forged relics, staged miracles, fake monks, and self-declaredly, men who promised divine healing in exchange for all your worldly possessions. Pilgrims had to walk a fine line between faith and foolishness. Still, most participated willingly. They knew the game. They were part of it. And after all, wasn't their own salvation worth a few coins? In the end, the road to heaven might have been lined with prayer, but it was paved with silver. Despite the loneliness of the road, very few pilgrims walked entirely alone. Safety in numbers was the rule, not the exception.